Hi, I'm Clay Kilgore from the Washington County Historical Society, and we're going to be talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. So today, I want to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion is a really interesting event that took place between 1791 and 1794. And it is the first test of the power of our national government. It is really the first uprising against the national government. It's one of the more important events in early American history, in that it kind of solidified the country and solidified the power of the national government. And if it never happened, we might not have held together the same way that we have. And so let's go back to the beginning. And we're going to start with the American Revolution. So the American Revolution breaks out, and the complaint that the colonists had is that they felt like they were overtaxed. They felt like they didn't have equal representation in the English government. And so they're upset about this. And they want, initially, not so much to break free and form their own country. They just want equal rights and equal representation and equal taxes as what is going on over in England and Great Britain. And they don't get that. And so they break free. And we have the American Revolution, and as we all know, we won, and the United States is formed. Well, that happens. It's 1783. The American Constitution, our new Constitution, goes into effect in 1789. And in 1791, the Whiskey Rebellion breaks out. So you're looking at a country that's less than 10 years old, and we're already having uprisings against the United States government, I guess is the best way of saying it. And so it's an important event because it's very early on in our history, and it shapes the way the country would be formed. So we're upset about, prior to the American Revolution, taxes and equal representation. Well, the Whiskey Rebellion, in a lot of ways, is about representation and equal taxes. What really sets it off are the farmers of southwestern Pennsylvania and western Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, those regions, feel like they're very separated from the national government. We've got the border, the barrier of the Allegheny Mountains, and they feel like they don't have as much say in the government as what people in the East would have. So they're upset about that. They feel like they're ignored in some cases, and so they're upset. They're upset about a lot of things. The inability to trade with the East because there's no road, no good road, access point over the mountains so they can get their goods to the East. So they want to take their goods down the Ohio River, down to the Mississippi and down to New Orleans. But they can't do that because Spain, who has control of New Orleans and the Mississippi River, they're putting a high tariff on goods that are going down the river. So the people out here, the farmers out here complain and say that our national government should do something to step in to stop Spain from putting this high tariff on, and our government does nothing. We're also upset about Native American attacks. The settlers out here, the farmers out here, everybody that lived on the western frontier knew somebody or had somebody in their family that had been killed in a Native American raid. And the farmers out here felt like the government should be doing something to help. That we're part of the country, and yet the government's doing nothing to assist with these raids. And it's left up to the farmers to defend themselves. And then in 1791, an excise tax is put in place. So the excise tax of 1791, and there's a lot of portions to the tax, and I'm not going to go into all of it. I really want to focus on one part of it, and that is an excise tax that is put on distilled spirits. So this tax that goes in place basically affects distillers. So if you own and operate a distillery, you have to pay a tax. And that was whether you were making, so we'll just go with whiskey, because out here in western Pennsylvania, the farmers made rye whiskey. So whether you were distilling to sell it, distilling to drink it, or distilling to trade it, you had to pay a tax. Well, a lot of farmers out here distilled whiskey. They distilled it for purposes of trade, to drink, or to sell, or to take down to New Orleans and try to sell it. There was a lot of reasons that went into them making whiskey. It was a lot easier to transport. It was worth more. But really what matters is that this tax that goes in place in 1791 affects the farmers out here. Because what you have to realize in Western Pennsylvania, there's not a lot of currency out here. So we don't have a lot of money, coinage that we're buying goods with. We're trading. We are trading our goods. We're using a barter system. And whiskey becomes more like currency on the Western frontier than actual coinage. And so the farmers are upset when this tax goes in place because they're taxing our currency. What we're using to buy goods that we need to survive, they're taxing. And it really affects the farmers out here. Now, when the government taxes it, what do they want in return? They don't want whiskey to pay the tax. They want coinage. Well, what don't we have a lot of? Coinage. We don't have a lot of currency. So that affects the farmers in that they can't pay their taxes. So when this tax goes on in 1791, there's a lot of complaints about it. So the farmers protest. The government sends out tax collectors to try to collect the tax, and the farmers protest. Now that protest comes in a lot of different forms. It could be rallies, it could be marches, it could be the raising of liberty poles. And a liberty pole was a large pole that would be raised in the middle of a town square. They would sometimes put a flag on top of it and streamers that would say no excise tax or down with the government, anything that was kind of anti-excise tax. So that was the form that some of the protests took. But in 1791, September of 1791, it took another form. In early September of that year, the farmers took into custody one of the tax collectors, a gentleman by the name of Robert Johnson. And when they took Robert Johnson into custody, they ended up tarring and feathering him. Now, a tar and feathering was something that you're going to see being used during the American Revolution to protest against English taxes. It is a harsh treatment towards a tax collector. So in a tar and feathering, the tax collector is going to be stripped down naked. He is going to have boiling tar or hot pine tar that's going to be poured over his head. Now, a lot of times they torture him beforehand. They would take sticks with rags wrapped around the ends, dipped into the hot tar, and they would poke the tax collector with that tar to kind of torture him a little bit. What they're trying to get him to do is to denounce the excise tax. They want him to denounce the tax and give up his post as tax collector, but also they want to send a message east that they won't pay their taxes. So they'll torture him a little bit, but in the end, they take the pine tar, they pour it over his head, and they take feathers and they throw the feathers on him. And because of the pine tar, the feathers stick to him. So the feathers are kind of a humiliation type thing, but it also leaves a lasting effect because that pine tar doesn't come off easily. And so it would burn the skin, it would stay on. You had to go to great effort to get the pine tar off. You had to use a mixture of whiskey and sand to try to scrub it off. And ironically, you used whiskey to help scrub it off. And that's what they were protesting, was a tax on whiskey. And so this left a message for the tax collector: don't come back and collect taxes. And then when he traveled east, it gave a message to the government that the farmers on the western frontier were not going to pay their taxes. So you have this initial protest against the excise tax that takes place, and things kind of die down a little bit. The government looks at different ways, maybe a different way to collect the tax. They realize they didn't have the infrastructure out here to collect it. And so they want to try to change it up and maybe make it so the farmers aren't so reluctant to pay their taxes or so against the excise tax. So what they end up doing is changing the tax slightly, in that when tax collectors come out here, they will register the farmer's stills. So if you owned a still, it would be registered based on capacity, so the amount that it was capable of making on a monthly basis. And that's what you would pay your tax on. You would pay a percentage tax, about 7 cents per gallon, for every gallon of whiskey you were capable of distilling, not on what you made, on what your still was capable of making. And that's where the farmers got upset later on, because they're being taxed on whiskey that they may not even make. They still might be registered at 30 gallons a month, but they're only making 15 gallons. So they had to pay for the 30 they could have made, not necessarily for the 15 that they did make. And so the protest picks back up in 1792 and 93 after the new registering of the stills goes into place. And so it kind of comes to a head in 1794. You know, the government, with Alexander Hamilton as the treasurer who has come up with the tax, and George Washington as president, they've been reluctant to take too much action against the farmers. They kind of wanted to see what would happen. But as the years go by, 1792 goes by, and 93, the farmers are getting more and more upset about this tax, and the protest escalates. And it comes to a head in the summer of 1794. Again, the government's been reluctant to take too much action. The farmers feel like they've been ignored. Through their representatives like David Bradford and Albert Gallatin, they've been trying to get their message to the East, that they weren't happy, that they weren't going to settle for this tax, and they weren't just going to sit down and pay it. And the government has basically ignored them. So when Bradford and Gallatin would come back and the farmers wanted to see what they had accomplished nothing. They weren't able to really get anything done on behalf of the farmers. And so people like John Holcroft, who becomes known as Tom the Tinker, a more violent leader of the rebellion, they start taking more actions. So they are now they are attacking the homes of tax collectors. They're burning down their homes. They're stoning a couple tax collectors. They tar and feather another tax collector. They threaten them. And so they're going after them with more violent actions. And David Bradford, who has been a representative for the farmers, is against this violence. But in the end, he sees it as the only way that the farmers might accomplish their goal of getting the government to take this tax off. So he takes on a leadership role in the rebellion in 1794. Well, how it comes to a head is that a gentleman by the name of David Lennox, he's a United States Marshal. He is sent out here to deliver writs or summons to the farmers who are delinquent in paying their taxes. So he is being escorted by the regional inspector of the excise tax, a gentleman by the name of John Neville. And John Neville and David Lennox go to the home of William Miller, who was a distiller, and they try to present him a summons that he would have to travel east to Philadelphia to face trial for not paying his taxes. William Miller did not respond real well to it, and actually him and a group of farmers ended up firing upon Neville and Lennox. Neville and Lennox escape. They return a few shots, but they escape, and Neville ends up going back to his home in Bower Hill, which is near present-day Bridgeville. The following day, July 16th, 1794, a group of farmers, about 30 of them, go to Neville's house, and they want Neville to turn over his tax records and hand over Lennox, because they say that he is handing out illegal writs. Neville does not respond real well, and he had actually armed his slaves, and they were helping to protect the home. So what ends up happening is you have a skirmish that takes place. Somebody fires a shot. We're not entirely sure who it is, but somebody fires a shot, and in this small skirmish that takes place, one of the farmers, a young farmer by the name of Oliver Miller, who was a nephew of William Miller, ends up getting killed. So the farmers, they escape, they retreat back, they take Miller back, he is dead. Now the following day, the farmers go back to Neville's house wanting revenge for the death of Oliver Miller. So they bring around 150 men with them, and they end up attacking the home. Now what's interesting about this is that you have the farmers with about 150 men. Over the course of the night, Neville had sent word to Fort Fayette up in Pittsburgh that he was afraid that the farmers might come back and attack. So Fort Fayette sends about 10 federal soldiers down to Neville's house to help protect the home. So the following day, you have this conflict that takes place called the Battle of Bower Hill between the farmers, led by the McFarland brothers, and the federal soldiers and Neville's slaves. It's interesting because this is the first time you're going to find federal soldiers firing upon United States citizens. but they are overwhelmed. There's 150 men that the farmers have. So they end up basically winning. They allow the soldiers to retreat back. The women and children are allowed through the lines. They retreat home to the home of Neville's son, Presley Neville. And the soldiers they retreat back to Fort Fayette. And the farmers think they've won this good battle, this great battle. They've defeated Neville, they've kicked him out of his post, and they've sent this message to the east that they're not going to settle and pay their taxes. But what they did is they brought the full attention of the national government upon them. And so the government George Washington finally decides that he's going to have to take action. And so he puts together an army. He calls on federal militiamen, or state militiamen, to form a federal militia of about 13,000 men. And he takes command of that federal militia himself. And he is still to this day the only standing president to lead federal troops. And they begin their march to the west. So they've got 13,000 men. With him is Alexander Hamilton. He wanted to come out and help defend his tax that he had come up with. He actually wanted to be in charge of the army, but Washington didn't want him to be, so he took command of it himself. Washington leads the army all the way to Bedford, PA. On October 19th of 1794, he's in Bedford, and he has started to get word that maybe the uprising out here, the insurrection out here, is not as solidified as he had hoped. Bradford had been taking actions to try to send word to the east that he had 5,000 men in an army out here ready to fight, and that the whole West was gathered, was joined together in this fight. But as the 13,000 man army is making their way to the west, word of that army is getting over the Allegheny Mountains to the farmers in the west here. And they're kind of looking around going, wait a minute, we don't actually have 5,000 men. That was just propaganda that Bradford was putting out there. And, if we go to battle, go to war, we're probably going to die. We're going to lose. We can't fight 13,000 men. So a lot of the farmers kind of start to give up before the federal militia ever makes their way out here. So word of this gets to Washington, gets to President Washington in Bedford, and he decides he is not needed to go the rest of the way west. So he turns over command of the army to Henry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee. And you may have never heard of him, but you've probably heard of his son, Robert E. Lee. And so Henry Lee leads the army out here with Alexander Hamilton as the second in command. And I'd like to tell you this wonderful story about the farmers, putting up this brave fight, and that they went to war and they were willing to fight to the last man to fight for their rights and for equal taxes and equal representation. Unfortunately, it didn't really occur that way. As this militia came into Western Pennsylvania, most of the farmers threw down their arms and gave up. They knew that they could not win. So the main action that this militia had to take was gathering up the leaders of the rebellion. David Bradford, John Holcroft, Tom the Tinker. They wanted to gather these men up and take them back to Philadelphia and put them on trial for treason. Now, David Bradford escapes. He's actually never captured. He escapes before the army gets here. He takes advice from his family and from his friends that if he sticks around and is captured, there's a really good chance that he's going to be hanged for treason. So he ends up fleeing to the Ohio Territory and then eventually down to New Orleans, where his family would move with him down in 1797, and he makes a new home for himself there. The army rolls in, they gather up what they think are some of the leaders of the rebellion. They do march some of these men back to Philadelphia, and some men actually do go to trial in Philadelphia. They take about 20 men back. Most of the charges are dropped before they ever face trial because they don't really have any evidence of what these farmers did. The other farmers aren't going to testify against them. So how do we know who the men were that actually did the tar and feathering? Nobody really truly knew who Tom the Tinker was. It was just a name that was being used. So they don't know that it's John Holcroft. And so most of the charges are dropped before they ever go to trial. But there are two men that are found guilty of treason. Philip Weigel and a William Mitchell. But in the end, Washington pardons them, and all the charges are dropped, and the farmers are allowed to go home. The only person they don't pardon is David Bradford. They kind of needed somebody as a scapegoat, somebody they could blame on the rebellion on, and that ends up being David Bradford. But in the end, in 1799, John Adams is president, and he eventually pardons David Bradford. Now, the excise tax doesn't go away until Thomas Jefferson becomes president in the early 1800s, but it's altered. So the farmers didn't win their rebellion, but they do make alterations to the excise tax to make it a little bit easier for the farmers to pay. And so in the end, they didn't win their uprising, win this insurrection, but they did kind of get what they wanted in that the excise tax is altered. And another thing that comes out of it is that there is a road that is constructed that connects the East and the West, and that is the National Road, which is another thing that they wanted so they could easily trade their goods with the East. They could easily get their goods to the East. So even though they didn't win, they did get some of what they wanted. What it did for the national government, it solidified the government, it pulled the government together, and basically strengthened that new national government and allowed the states to stay together and the United States not to splinter, not to break apart. And 200 years later, we're still here today. So we can kind of thank this uprising in the western portion of the state really for the country still being here today.